Imagine controlling the finances of an entire continent, not one country, an entire continent. Imagine that kings, emperors, and prime ministers all came to you, hat in hand, asking for money. That was the Rothschild family. And for over a century, no one even came close. But power, no matter how absolute it seems, is never permanent. And the fall of the Rothschilds isn't a story about scandal. It's not a story about war or theft or betrayal. It's something far more haunting than that. It's the story of a family, a Sao, who built the most sophisticated financial machine the world had ever seen, and then watched the world slowly, quietly leave them behind. To understand what they lost, you first have to understand what they built. And it all starts in a place most people have never heard of, a single street in Frankfurt, Germany, called the Judengasse, the Jews' Lane. It was a ghetto, walled off from the rest of the city. The gates were locked at night. Jews couldn't own land outside its walls, couldn't work in most professions, were taxed simply for existing. This was the world Mayer Amschel Rothschild was born into in 1744. But Mayer Amschel had something the walls couldn't contain. He had a mind for systems, not just for money and for how money moved, who needed it, when, and what they'd pay to get it. He started as a coin dealer, small transactions, rare coins, wealthy collectors. But he was playing a longer game than anyone realized. He cultivated a relationship with Wilhelm I, the Prince of Hesse, one of the richest men in Europe, a man who made his fortune renting soldiers to foreign armies. Mayer became his financial agent, and in doing so, he gained something more valuable than money. He gained access to the networks, the intelligence, and the trust of royalty. And he never wasted it. When Mayer Amschel had 5 sons, he didn't divide his business, he multiplied it. He sent each son to a different financial capital of Europe. Amschel stayed in Frankfurt. Salomon went to Vienna, Nathan went to London, Kalman went to Naples, and Jacob went to Paris. 5 cities, 5 banks, 1 family, and 1 network. Think about what that meant in the early 1800s. There were no telegraphs, no telephones, no Reuters, no Bloomberg. Information traveled at the speed of a horse or a ship. And in a world like that, the Rothschilds had carrier pigeons. They had their own private courier network, letters written in a private cipher only they could read. They knew things before governments knew them, before markets knew them, before anyone knew them. And in finance, that kind of edge doesn't just make you wealthy, it makes you untouchable. Nowhere was that edge more visible than during the Napoleonic Wars. Europe was tearing itself apart. Armies were marching across borders. Governments were collapsing overnight. And every nation, every single one, needed money to fight. The Rothschilds provided it to both sides, not out of cruelty and out of logic. Wars end, debts don't. But it was the Battle of Waterloo that cemented their legend. On June 18th, 1815, Napoleon met Wellington on a muddy Belgian field. The fate of Europe hung in the balance. Financial markets across the continent were paralyzed with fear. If Napoleon won, British bonds would collapse. If he lost, they'd soar. Everyone was waiting. Everyone except Nathan Rothschild. His couriers reached London before the official government messengers. He knew the outcome before anyone else. What he did next made him a legend. He walked onto the floor of the London Stock Exchange, and he sold. He started selling British bonds. The market watched. If Nathan Rothschild was selling, that could only mean one thing. Napoleon must have won. Panic spread, prices collapsed, and then, quietly, through agents across the floor, Nathan bought. He bought everything at rock-bottom prices. Hours later, the news arrived. Wellington had won. Napoleon was finished. British bonds exploded in value, and Nathan Rothschild made a fortune so vast, it was said he multiplied his wealth 20 times over in a single day. In one afternoon, the Rothschilds didn't just profit from history, and they shaped it. The decades that followed were the golden age of the Rothschild Empire. They financed the British government's purchase of the Suez Canal. They backed the railroads that stitched Europe together. They funded the diamond mines of South Africa. They loaned money to nations in crisis and collected not just interest but influence. When Brazil needed to stabilize its currency, they called the Rothschilds. When the United States needed emergency gold reserves in 1895, they called the Rothschilds. When Austria-Hungary teetered on the edge of financial collapse, they called the Rothschilds. At their peak, it was estimated the Rothschild family controlled wealth equivalent to trillions of dollars in today's terms, more than any individual institution or nation on Earth. They didn't just sit at the table of power, they owned the table. But the very things that made them great were quietly becoming their greatest vulnerabilities. The first crack appeared in their model of secrecy. For generations, the Rothschilds had operated as a private family partnership. No outside shareholders, no public scrutiny, total control, total discretion. But the world of finance was changing. New institutions were rising, joint stock banks that could raise massive capital from thousands of investors. Suddenly, the Rothschild model, brilliant as it was, looked small by comparison. They could only grow as fast as the family could accumulate wealth. These new banks had no such limit. The second crack was geography. The Rothschilds had built their empire on European finance, but the center of gravity in the global economy was shifting. America was industrializing at a speed that defied comprehension. Steel, oil, railroads, electricity, and the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Morgans. New titans were rising in the West, and the Rothschilds were not among them. They had been invited to finance American railroads early on, and they declined. Too risky, too far, too unfamiliar. It was perhaps the most expensive decision in their history. The third crack was the one that hurt most. The family itself. Mayer Amschel's genius wasn't just financial, and it was organizational. He had written strict rules for the family partnership. Only male descendants could be partners. Disputes were to be settled internally. The family moved as one. For 2 generations, this iron discipline had been their greatest weapon. But by the late 1800s, cracks were forming. Different branches had different priorities, different politics, different ambitions. The London branch was pulling away from the Paris branch. The Frankfurt office closed in 1901, with no male heirs to continue it. The Naples branch had already shuttered decades before. The 5-city network that had once spanned a continent was quietly contracting. And then came the wars. Not the wars they had financed for profit, but the wars that would define the 20th century. World War I shattered the European order the Rothschilds had spent a century navigating. The old empires, Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans, the Russian Tsar, all collapsed. The relationships, the debts, the influence they had carefully cultivated across generations evaporated almost overnight. And then came something far darker. The rise of the Nazi Party in Germany. For centuries, anti-Semitism had been the background noise of European life. The Rothschilds had learned to operate within it, around it, sometimes above it. But the Nazis were something different entirely. They didn't just resent Jewish wealth. They made its destruction a national project. The Rothschild banks in Vienna and Paris were seized. Artwork collected over generations, priceless, irreplaceable, was stolen. Family members fled across borders. Some escaped, some did not. What the Nazis couldn't take, they destroyed. It was not just a financial blow, it was a wound that went far deeper than money. After the war, the Rothschilds rebuilt, because that is what they had always done, but the world they returned to was fundamentally different. The age of family banking dynasties was ending. Governments now had central banks. Markets had regulators. Capital flowed through institutions, not through courier pigeons and private letters. The advantages the Rothschilds had spent a century building had been democratized. Anyone with a telegraph could move information fast. Anyone with enough investors could raise capital. The edge was gone. There was no dramatic collapse, no single moment of failure, just a slow, steady erosion of relevance, like a great river worn down over centuries, until what once carved canyons becomes just a stream. Today, the Rothschild name still exists. Rothschild and Company is a respected investment bank. The family still holds significant wealth. They still matter, but they are no longer singular, no longer untouchable, no longer the ones who move history, and perhaps that is the deepest lesson of their story. Power is never a destination. It's a position, one you have to earn and re-earn and earn again. The Rothschilds earned it spectacularly. They held it longer than almost anyone in history, but they couldn't hold it forever. Because no one can. The world doesn't stand still for dynasties. It never has. It never will. They didn't disappear. They just stopped being the only ones who mattered. And in a system built entirely on advantage, that is the same thing as falling.